Hello, welcome to Paramusic TV. I'm Johnny Long with another edition of Classic Case Review. And on this edition we'll be looking at the case of Doris Bither, but probably better known as the Entity, which happened in Culver City, California, like all the cases that are featured on this show. This case caused quite a stir and would also result in a book and a movie, which happened to a lot of the other cases I've looked at, such as the Amityville Horror and the Enfield Poltergeist in England. I'm trying to put these stories to where you can see the similarities in a lot of them. Of course, they're not all exactly the same. They definitely seem to have different personalities and different reasons for doing what they do. Now, I guess I should mention that if you are sensitive to such things as sexual abuse, you probably don't want to see this video. But getting past that, if you'd also like to like and subscribe, please do so, and we'll get into this case, the Entity. The case would come to the attention of parapsychologist Kerry Gaynor and another colleague from the Parapsychology Laboratory in UCLA, as they had stopped into a small bookstore and were looking at the paranormal section, which of course it wasn't called that back in these times. However, a woman had overheard the two men talking and approached them, telling them that she had been having experiences in her home. Her name was Doris Bither. She had recently moved into a new home in Culver City, California, and ever since moving into the home had been experiencing violent activity. After talking for a few minutes, they set a date for the investigators to come to the house. Gaynor would bring his partner from the lab, Barry Taff, and on that day, although they didn't do much investigating, they did a preliminary interview with Bither, and during the almost 2-hour conversation, Gaynor and Taff both felt like she was hiding something, and finally, after the questioning was over, she confided to them that not only was she experiencing activity such as things flying around the house and seeing light anomalies, she confided to them that she had also been sexually assaulted by the spirit. Now, Taff and Gaynor did not believe her at first until she showed them the bruises. Bruises on the inner thigh and her arms and her legs, the kind of injuries you might expect to see with a sexual assault. But again, Taff especially was unwilling to completely believe this story and suggested that perhaps Bither should see a psychiatrist. He recommended a name, and they parted ways. Until a couple of weeks later, when Doris called them back and said the activity had been so bad that other people were also witnessing things. So they returned to the house, and upon their return, they would also see activity. As they investigated each room, they would find that Doris's bedroom, although the rest of the house was normal temperature, her bedroom was cold. It still registered the same temperature as the rest of the house, but they both felt the chill. Upon returning to the kitchen where Doris was talking to a neighbor, Gaynor and Taff took out their notebooks and began to ask questions, when suddenly a cabinet door opened and a pan shot across the kitchen, landing in the middle of the floor. Now, Gaynor and Taff, who were still skeptical of Doris's claims, began to check the cabinet for any devices that may have been set up ahead of time, but found no wires or anything that could account for what had just happened. They would interview some of the people that had come to the house. Most of them had experienced things, and began to tell pretty much the same story when it comes to a lot of the activity that they saw, which was mostly things being moved, anomalous lights, and a powerful stench that all of them described as decaying flesh. And it wasn't constant. It would come in waves. And try as they might, they could not find the source of this smell. So now Taff and Gaynor put together a team, and for the next couple of months stay at the house. Now keep in mind, this was 1974, and a lot of the equipment that's available today wasn't back then. So most of the evidence comes in the form of photographs. When Doris, who had began to sense the entity, would tell them where she believed it was standing, Kerry Gaynor, who had a Polaroid camera, which of course would instantly develop after taking the picture, the places where she said that the entity was, when he'd take a picture, it would be completely whited out. And when she said it left, he would take another picture in that same area, and the picture would turn out just fine. This happened 3 or 4 times over the course of the next few moments. One particular night was probably the most climactic, in front of about 20 some odd people, crammed in the little bedroom. Everyone started seeing light anomalies. As you can see in this photograph, the arc that you see seems to be suspended in the middle of the room. It's not reflecting off of a surface, and it seems to be independent of the curvatures in the walls, as if it was in the picture, but going by at such a speed that the camera couldn't catch it exactly as it looked as they were watching it. But the grand finale for all of this would be when the lights that had been floating around the room gathered in one area and began to form what looked to everyone in the room to be the upper torso of a very large muscular man. And he seemed to be gesturing and moving about as if he was communicating with something else that they couldn't see. The odor that had been described before appeared again, actually making some of the people in the room vomit. After all of this occurred, Gaynor and Taff would interview all the witnesses individually, who all testified to seeing all the same things. Everything from the orbs to the actual apparition. Now, not long after this, Doris decided to move from the house in Culver City. Of course, this was an attempt to escape the activity. Unfortunately, this did not work. Most of the violent activities, such as the sexual assaults, seemed to stop. As a matter of fact, they had stopped actually before the investigation really began. However, she was still experiencing other phenomena and would again call Gaynor and Taff for one more investigation. Now, they tried to keep this very secret because not only was Doris trying to escape the paranormal activity, but she was also trying to escape the notoriety. After they set up their equipment, they were talking to Bither when a vase sitting on a shelf flew across the room, whizzing past them and smashing against the wall. Now, a tape recorder was set up at this point with a microphone, and in the seconds before the vase flew across the room, according to the investigators, they could hear the sound of somebody walking up to the microphone of the recorder with a stepping and dragging sound as if the person had some sort of limp, and there was a bit of heavy breathing. The investigators did not hear this at the time, so it was clear that Bither was still experiencing phenomena, even though she was no longer in the house at Culver City. After this time, Taff and Gaynor made no more visits to any of the homes that she lived in after this last investigation. In fact, Taff says that they lost all contact with Bither until about 1978, when Frank De Filita contacted Taff, telling him that he had been writing a book based on Bither's story, whom he had met some time before. According to Taff, she opened up to De Filita even more so than she had to Taff and Gaynor when they were investigating the case. Now, unfortunately, the book, and later the movie, would suffer from the same problems that the Amityville Horror did, when it seemed that the preferred writing style of the day was to turn these stories into a novel instead of more of a documentary. For instance, the Enfield Poltergeist, which was written by Guy Lyon Playfair, who was one of the investigators on the case, actually wrote it as he was experiencing a lot of the phenomenon and was therefore more of a documentary. However, the Amityville Horror and now the Entity were written in novel form based on the stories told by Bither, but when he contacted Taff, he wished for them to contribute to a couple of chapters of the book. Asked Taff if he had to do it all over again and had everything he wanted and needed to conduct the investigation in the way he would like, what would he have done? And scenes from the book and the movie reflect how he wished he could have done the investigation. Now, we talk about him being part of UCLA's parapsychology department, but according to Taff, UCLA did not support the efforts of the investigation of the Entity home or any other investigations that they did. The laboratory at UCLA no longer exists. So the scenes in the movie and in the climax of the book, where a laboratory was set up in a gymnasium with a mock-up of Bither's home, and the equipment that was being used to monitor the events that happened within it, were totally fictional, based on the things that Taff would have liked to have done. Now, of all the investigations Taff claims to have done, the Entity case is one of about 3 that he considers the most baffling. Now, one of the theories that Taff has since come up with has been that poltergeists sometimes seem to center in on people who might be prone to having seizures or maybe have epilepsy. At the time that he investigated the Entity case, he had not yet come up with this theory. But when you look at some other cases, like the Bell Witch and the Enfield Poltergeists, there are stories about the epicenter of the activity going into seizures. Now, this doesn't seem to have happened in the Amityville Horror. And in some of the other cases that I will be covering, this doesn't seem to have been a reported part of the case. Bither was also apparently an alcoholic, and Taff did say that during the investigation that when she became more inebriated that the activity did seem to pick up. Now, of course, this is not any kind of judgment towards Doris Bither, but this isn't the only case I've seen where substance abuse sometimes seems connected to what's going on. Taff also seems reluctant to completely believe Doris's claim of sexual assault by the spirits. Now, Brian Harris, Doris's son, claims that most of the time when she was being attacked, it was as if an invisible person was there, slapping and beating, pushing her down, and his attempts to intervene were in vain when he would just be thrown across the room. His mother's bedroom, which was right next to his, quite often would hear her being attacked, and there was nothing he could do but listen. Now, this isn't exactly the end of the case. Phenomena still followed her. This also happened in the Amityville Horror, when after the Lutz family living at the house on Ocean Avenue, fled after 28 days of living there, even after moving to California, that although to a far lesser degree, they were still experiencing things. The infill poltergeist ended, and as far as I know, no more activity was reported by the family, although Janet Hodgson, who was the center of the activity, did claim that she always felt that, given the right circumstances, it could come back. You could always feel it waiting. But I do believe Bither did experience the things she said she did. The sexual assaults were not a huge part of this story. By the time Taff and Gaynor came onto the case, as far as anyone knows for the rest of the duration of Bither's life, the sexual assaults came to an end. Doris Bither would pass away in 1999. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Classic Case Review. Thank you for watching. And again, please like and subscribe. Thank you very much.